Hey, it's Luminostic from Vilcabamba, Ecuador, and today we're going to talk a little bit about dimethyltryptamine, commonly known as DMT. There's a lot of attention being given to this compound right now. Obviously, it's present in ayahuasca, and it's also used in its pure form. So do me a favor, take a second to hit the like button, subscribe. Okay, so basically, the other day I was walking down a trail in the bamboo forest, and I was thinking about DMT because I just had an experience with it, and I thought, certain bits of information that I thought I knew, I wasn't really actually sure what the sources were. And these are things that are very commonly believed. One of them is that the DMT is manufactured in the pineal gland, which, is like basically where the third eye should be, which is kind of an interesting thing that, for thousands of years in India, they've identified this space in the forehead as, the source of our spiritual mojo or whatever, or second sight. And the most mind-blowingly intense psychedelic drug known to man is supposedly created there. So, if true, that would be a really interesting discovery. But I realized that, along with the idea that DMT is released when you're born and when you die, that I hadn't actually figured out where this information had come from. So I decided to look. And what I discovered is that while not known to be untrue, some of these facts are actually unsubstantiated, and I did trace some of the rumors back. So the idea that it's released when you're born and when you die comes from Dr. Rick Strassman, the author of The Spirit Molecule, and the MD that got permission to do research with DMT, I think in the 90s in the United States. If you haven't done research, or if you haven't watched the documentary DMT and the Spirit Molecule, I highly recommend that. They injected, I think, 1,000 people with very high doses of DMT, and then recorded their experiences. And they chose people from all different walks of life. There's one guy that was like a Native American medicine man, and there's like a janitor and a high school teacher, and all these different types of people they made case studies out of. And probably the most interesting thing that comes to light during these experiments, Rick Strassman, the doctor, and here, bear in mind, this is a straight guy. He doesn't do psychedelic drugs. He just became fascinated with DMT. I'm not really sure why. So, he somehow got permission from the federal government to do these experiments. And after a while, he started to notice something. He noticed that different people with no background information, so it's not like they're expecting this stuff, would encounter one of like 5 or 6 different archetypal intelligences. There's like the mantoids, they've come to be called, the metallic bees. There are the self-transforming machine elves that Terence McKenna described. And I've got a fantastic story about those creatures I'll get to at some point. But the point being, there are all these different archetypal beings, and depending on which being you encounter, the jesters are another really common one. They're always they have the same message. And Strassman became convinced that these people were interacting with real intelligences. So he said the idea that some psychedelic drug was actually putting people into some kind of rapport with interdimensional beings of some kind was too much, and it messed with his worldview. And he actually voluntarily shut his own study down because it was just too much for him. Eventually, he started the study back up and resumed his research. And at any rate, though, that's a very good resource, and it's actually the source of the urban myth that DMT is released when you're born and when you die. He hypothesized that. There is a group of researchers currently looking into it to try to see if they can confirm that this happens. The idea that it's manufactured in the pineal gland did get a little bit of like hypothetical confirmation, I guess, anecdotal evidence, because it was discovered in the pineal glands of rats recently. So it does seem to be, at least possible. Also, I think we know that a lot of it is secreted in the lungs. So now that we've talked a little bit about what DMT does, or doesn't do, I'll get into a little bit of the specifics of how it's used and what happens when you use it. So, very small amount is needed. It's usually extracted from Mimosa hostilis. It's found in pretty high concentrations in the root bark. So it's a pretty simple process. It's used to extract it, and then you use between uh, zero point 0.3 or 0.03, 0.05. Some people put as much as 0.12, and we're talking about grams, so it's tenths of grams, milligrams. Um, my personal experience is that starting with a lighter dose is a very bad idea. I find that when you don't cross all the way over with DMT, it can be kind of terrifying and uncomfortable. So I advise that, and I really don't see that there's much more tendency for people to have a bad experience or to, freak out, or however you want to put it, with higher doses. It actually seems less likely. So my advice is that if you're going to do it, go hard, go big or go home. There's just really no point in taking a lower dose of DMT. If anything, it's actually harder. So I would recommend, between 0.05 and zero point 0.1, even for the beginner. It's very difficult to consume enough because it comes on very rapidly. So by the third hit, I've seen a lot of people, they just can't function well enough to get the third inhalation down, and they'll just kind of fold up, and it's 10 minutes later you're completely normal. And then as far as like exactly what the effects are, that we don't have language for this. There are, in Jewish mysticism, 3 veils between worlds, and it seems to me that as you ingest larger amounts of DMT, you pass successively through each one of these veils. Beyond the first veil, and this is something I've actually correlated with a lot of other people that have had experiences with, like the Wilco seed, which actually contains 3 different forms of DMT. And I should mention, while we're on the subject there, that NN-DMT is usually the one that we're talking about when we're talking about smoking it. Pure DMT, it's the most common. 5-MeO-DMT is widely associated with the Sonoran desert toad, and it's supposed to be actually like the holiest and most powerful experience that comes from using any form of DMT. And then bufotenin or 5-HO-DMT is also present in the toad, but the Wilco seed, for example, has all 3 forms in varying quantities depending on the, where you are, what strain of tree. Even in my experience from tree to tree, it seems like the ratios will vary a little bit. So mostly in this video, we're talking specifically about N-dimethyltryptamine, that is an endogenous neurotransmitter, and comes from largely from Mimosa hostilis. Okay, so kind of lost track a little bit there, but I think we were talking about the successive veils. The first one is sort of like red and orange pulsing. There seems to be a presence of like a sort of diabolical, gestury, clown kind of intelligence. Most people don't really like getting stuck there. That's one of the reasons that taking the lower doses of Wilco or DMT is not so much advisable. Beyond that veil, it's like a realm where there are staggering geometries that sort of pulsate and change form, and beyond that is where they call it a breakthrough or hyperspace, and any number of things can happen, but this seems to be where the entities, the various intelligences that people tend to interact with, are beyond this third veil in hyperspace. So those tend to fall into the most common 5 categories, as I said earlier. The mantoids, which tend to have a message that they're trying to explain what the function of insect consciousness is in the universe. They're trying to get us to relate to it and understand it in such a way that it benefits the collective of humankind, so that we can take this information, apply it to the way we exist, and take the best from it and use it. The metallic bees, I've never encountered them. I can't think right away what it is that their message is. The self-transforming machine elves are very interesting. I actually had an experience with someone the first time they smoked DMT. They had not ever read any Terence McKenna, had never seen this description themselves, hadn't done any research. This was a while back before DMT became very trendy and popular. This ex-girlfriend of mine smoked it, and she said that there were these like elf-like creatures that had these Rubik's Cubes type things, and they were trying to show her, look, this is how we make different dimensions. You can do it too. And then they tried to show her how to make an object with sound. If you're familiar with Terence McKenna, you'll recognize that exact description of these beings. So that was really interesting to me to see for myself, someone that had no background information, to encounter one of these things and describe not only what they look like, what they're doing, and what they're communicating exactly the way that somebody else that I was familiar with had. So, I don't know exactly what to make of that, but to me it at least suggests that these things have some kind of objective reality. And then there are the jesters, and it's very difficult to explain the jesters. They seem good-humored, but also there's this sort of like malevolence to them that a lot of people find really disturbing. They don't really seem to have much of a message. They're just kind of like, maybe their message is, the experience is just about the experience. We are here in the universe to observe and take part in the looniness of it all, the unbelievability, um, the awe and improbability of it all. But maybe they're just some weird archetypal consciousness that doesn't need to make any kind of sense. Also, I don't think I mentioned that DMT is the active constituent in ayahuasca in terms of the visions. The vine alone is medicine. It does cause purging. It does cause some kind of altered state, but without the DMT, the visions that are associated with ayahuasca will not happen. Also, with ayahuasca, if you're familiar with the character of pure DMT, you see that it's very, very similar. You can sense and observe in the character of the visions the presence of the DMT, which is very interesting. That it definitely changes. The hormala alkaloids definitely have an influence when you take ayahuasca, and it changes the speed of the DMT, and it changes the personality. It's a little bit less intense, much longer, and very different, but still somehow very much the same. So that also has always been fascinating to me, that when DMT works in conjunction with other compounds, sometimes it preserves its essential character, but it still evolves. Another interesting bit of information that I can offer is that a lot of times the DMT visions, including with ayahuasca, can seem very nonsensical, and a lot of times I would come away with from this thinking, what is the point? It's amazing, but all these just strange visions and stuff, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. And one time I remember I drank ayahuasca and I was watching this bizarre, like, kind of like a cartoon of like a trolley, maybe painted by a Japanese artist or something, and way weirder than that, but that's kind of the gist of the aesthetic of it. And I asked Pachamama, the spirit of ayahuasca, what is the point of this? It makes no sense. And she said, you don't need to understand everything. The mind communicates in symbols. So if your conscious mind doesn't understand something that's being revealed to you, it doesn't mean that your subconscious mind doesn't. So just don't worry about it. Just observe these things and just take them for what they are. And I thought that was an amazing answer that, I don't know if I really could have devised. Speaking of answers that I couldn't necessarily devise, there are lots and lots of instances of sort of DMT revealing future events to people. And I've had some experience with that, and I know a lot of other people that have. In fact, the compounds that are in the ayahuasca vine were originally called telepamine by the researchers, because the reports of telepathy going all the way back to like the 16th century, when the conquistadors first started encountering ayahuasca and shamans in the jungle. So I'm going to stop there for now. I'm probably going to make another one later about that very fact, DMT and prophecy. So thanks a lot for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe. Please support us on Patreon.